The air in the Special Collections archive was a living thing, thick with the ghosts of 1,000 stories. It smelled of brittle paper, of decaying leather, and the faint, acidic tang of time itself. For Alara Vance, this was the only air she could breathe without feeling the weight of the world crushing her lungs. Her fingers, delicate and sure, traced the faded gilt on the spine of a 17th-century folio, a motion as practiced and unconscious as a prayer. At 22, she was an intern here, a custodian of forgotten worlds, meticulously mending the wounds of history with a surgeon's precision. Each stitch she placed, each tear she sealed with Japanese paper, was an act of devotion. She was preserving beauty, holding back the inevitable tide of decay for these precious objects, even as her own life felt like it was turning to dust between her fingers, unread and uncherished. If you want to know how a single, impossible offer could shatter this fragile piece, watch until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and comment on where you're watching from. We continue. Alara existed in shades of gray and sepia, a figure perfectly camouflaged against the backdrop of towering mahogany shelves. Her movements were economical, her presence so quiet she could work for hours without a single floorboard creaking in protest. She wore her long, dark hair pulled back in a simple knot, not for style but for practicality, to keep it from obscuring the delicate work under her hands. Her eyes, a startlingly clear shade of hazel, were her most expressive feature, though few ever got close enough to notice. They held a deep, scholarly focus that could just as easily be mistaken for profound sadness. She was a creature of silence and solitude, more comfortable with the dead authors who lined the walls than with the living, breathing students who hurried across the university quad outside her window. Her world had shrunk to the dimensions of a library carrel. Beneath the calm, meticulous surface of the book restorer was a young woman drowning in a sea of quiet desperation. The archive was her sanctuary, but it was also her cage. Every morning, she left one silent, oppressive space, the brownstone where her father's brilliant mind was slowly being erased by illness, for another. Her youth was a currency she spent not on laughter or late nights, but on sterile-smelling antiseptics and the endless, crushing weight of medical debt. A deep, hollow ache had taken up permanent residence in her chest, a constant reminder of the friendships she'd let wither, the experiences she'd never had, the life she had sacrificed on the altar of duty. She was a ghost haunting the edges of her own existence, her heart beating in a rhythm of love, guilt, and suffocating obligation. Her innocence was not a virtue she cultivated, but a wall built brick by brick from circumstance and responsibility. At an age when other women were exploring the messy, exhilarating landscapes of love and desire, Alara was charting the decline of a beloved parent. Virginity for her wasn't a choice born of moral conviction or shyness, but the simple, stark result of a life unlived. It was a blank page in the center of her story, a chapter she didn't know how to begin writing. Sometimes, while mending a fragile book of poetry, she would find a pressed flower or a lover's inscription in a faded margin and feel a pang of longing so sharp it stole her breath. It was a glimpse into a world of intimate connection, a language she understood in theory but had never been given the chance to speak. The gentle scrape of her bone folder against vellum was suddenly shattered by the vibration of her phone against the heavy oak table. The screen lit up with the cold, impersonal blue of a banking app notification. Insufficient funds. The message was a digital slap, a brutal intrusion of reality into her cloistered world. The priceless manuscript in her hands was insured for a sum that could save her family 10 times over, yet she couldn't afford the copay for her father's next round of medication. The irony was a bitter pill she swallowed daily. The historic brownstone, their family home filled with generations of books and memories, was on the brink of foreclosure. The weight of it all pressed down on her. The fear of failure, a physical presence that made it hard to breathe. She was failing the one person who had always believed in her. She pushed back her chair and walked to the tall, arched window overlooking the main campus green. It was a perfect autumn afternoon. Students sprawled on the grass, their laughter carrying faintly through the thick, leaded glass. A couple walked hand in hand, their heads bent close together, sharing a secret. Alara watched them, feeling like a scientist observing an alien species. She felt an invisible barrier between herself and them, a wall of responsibility and worry that made their casual freedom seem like an impossible dream. She was of their world, but not in it. A profound loneliness washed over her, cold and vast. She placed a hand against the cool glass. The gesture, a futile attempt to bridge the chasm that separated her from a life she was only allowed to witness from a distance. Returning to her workbench, Ilara picked up her needle, the slender piece of steel feeling impossibly heavy in her hand. She looked down at the medieval manuscript, at the patient, beautiful script that had survived for centuries. It was a testament to endurance, to the power of a story to outlast its creator. She felt a kinship with it. Both of them were fragile, bound, and holding a history of immense value that the outside world seemed determined to acquire or discard without a thought. With a sigh that carried the weight of her entire world, she guided the needle through the spine, her focus narrowing once more. She would continue her work. She would continue to preserve. It was the only thing she knew how to do, stitching together the past while her own future unraveled, thread by silent thread. The historic Boston brownstone was not a home. It was a mausoleum. It stood shoulder to shoulder with its immaculate neighbors on a tree-lined street in Back Bay. But a closer look revealed the subtle signs of decay. A faint web of cracks spidered from a corner of the bay window, and the polished brass of the door knocker had dulled to a weary bronze. Inside, the air was still and heavy, saturated with the scent of lemon polish, old paper, and the sterile undertone of antiseptic. Dust motes danced like tiny ghosts in the slanted afternoon light that struggled to penetrate the heavy velvet curtains. For Ilara, these walls were both a fortress protecting her father's legacy and the bars of her own gilded cage, each book-lined hallway a corridor in a prison of love and memory. Her father, Professor Alistair Vance, was the silent, enthroned king of this decaying kingdom. He spent his days in a worn leather armchair in the library, a thick tartan blanket draped over his knees even in the mildest weather. Once a towering figure in the world of classical literature, a man whose lectures could hold 1,000 students spellbound, he was now a fragile echo of himself. His mind, once a library of breathtaking scope, had become a labyrinth of forgotten corridors and locked rooms. Ilara would watch him, his gaze lost somewhere in the middle distance, and her heart would fracture all over again. She saw not the shell of the man before her, but the brilliant, laughing father who had taught her to read Homer in the original Greek, and the weight of that memory was a crushing, unbearable love. Each day was a meticulously choreographed ballet of care and containment. Ilara rose before the sun, her movements a whisper on the creaking floorboards, preparing the soft, easy-to-swallow meals her father required. She laid out his medications in a small, color-coded pillbox, a rainbow of chemicals that held the fog in his mind at bay, but at a cost that felt like a pound of her own flesh. There was a rhythm to her service, the gentle coaxing to eat, the patient reading aloud from his favorite poets, the quiet companionship that asked for nothing in return. This routine was the bedrock of her existence, a series of selfless acts that had slowly, imperceptibly, erased the outlines of her own identity, leaving only the shape of a caregiver in her place. The arrival of the mail was a daily ritual of dread. Ilara would wait for the telltale clatter of the brass mail slot, her stomach tightening into a cold, hard knot. She'd gather the envelopes from the floor, her fingers sorting them with a grim efficiency. Junk mail, alumni magazines, and then the ones that mattered. The windowed envelopes, their contents starkly visible, were like small, paper-thin bombs. Past due. Final notice. The words screamed in bold red letters, a stark, brutal counterpoint to the quiet dignity of their home. She would quickly hide them in a drawer in the kitchen, a secret archive of their ruin, shielding her father from the reality that the very walls around them were no longer truly their own. The lie was another brick in the wall of her isolation. The ghost of her mother was a constant, silent presence in the house. She existed in the faint, lingering scent of jasmine in the upstairs linen closet, in the severe gaze of her portrait that hung in the formal dining room, a room they no longer used. Her mother had been a woman of expectations, a product of old Boston society who believed in proper marriages, stable finances, and a life lived according to a well-defined script. Ilara often wondered what she would think of her now, unmarried, uncourted, and acting as a nursemaid in a house hemorrhaging money. The unspoken pressure to have followed a different path, to have secured a future through a respectable match, was a form of judgment that echoed in the house's profound silence, a quiet accusation of her failure on all fronts. Her phone would occasionally light up with a message from a college acquaintance, a ghost from a life she'd briefly touched, an invitation to a gallery opening, a casual drinks tonight text. Each one was a small, sharp sting. Elara would type out a polite, vague refusal. So sorry, family commitment, feeling the chasm between her world and theirs widen with every word. She would scroll through their social media feeds, a voyeuristic glimpse into a universe of carefree laughter, travel, and budding romances. It felt like watching a foreign film without subtitles. She didn't resent their freedom. She was simply mystified by it. Her own youth felt like a story being told about someone else, a narrative she had no part in writing. Walking through the neighborhood was its own form of quiet torture. The perfectly manicured gardens, the gleaming windows of the neighboring brownstones, the sounds of dinner parties spilling out onto meticulously kept patios. It all served as a constant, glaring reminder of their own precarious position. She felt the weight of their neighbors' gazes, a mixture of pity and veiled curiosity. She was the, quote, Vance girl, the quiet, dutiful daughter chained to a fading legacy. The social fabric of their world was woven from wealth, influence, and the appearance of effortless stability. They were failing on every count, their slow-motion collapse happening in plain sight, a spectacle of quiet desperation that made her feel both invisible and intensely scrutinized at the same time. The library was the heart of the house, and the heaviest part of her burden. It was a magnificent room, 2 stories high, with rolling ladders and shelves crammed with first editions that would make a collector weep. This was her father's life's work, his soul made manifest in leather and vellum. It was also their only remaining asset of any real value. The thought of selling them, of dismantling this sanctuary piece by piece, felt like a sacrilege. It would be the final betrayal, an admission that his entire life, his passion, was worth nothing more than the price on a tag. So the books remained, silent witnesses to their plight, a treasure trove of intellectual capital that could not be converted into the cold, hard cash they so desperately needed to survive. One evening, as Elara was helping her father with his dinner, he looked at her with a moment of startling clarity. "Eleanor," he said, his voice raspy but firm, using her mother's name, "you must not let this house become your cage. Your life is meant to be a grand epic, not a footnote in mine." The lucidity was a flash of lightning, illuminating the profound love and the profound fear in his eyes before the fog rolled back in, leaving him confused and agitated. The words hung in the air, a beautiful, devastating gift. He saw her. He understood. The knowledge did not liberate her. Instead, it twisted the knife of her guilt deeper. To save him, she had to sacrifice the very epic life he wanted for her. As night fell, the house settled into a deeper, more profound silence. Elara would sit by the window in her small bedroom, looking out at the city lights twinkling in the distance. The world felt impossibly far away. She was trapped, not just by circumstance, but by the fierce, unwavering depth of her love. It was a love that demanded everything, that had consumed her youth and her future. The brownstone was no longer a home. It was a sarcophagus, and she was its voluntary, living guardian, entombed with the man she would do anything to save. The weight of an impossible choice was beginning to form in the darkness, a terrifying question taking shape. What was the one thing she wouldn't sacrifice? She was afraid she already knew the answer. The silence of the archive was shattered not by a sound, but by a presence. It was a shift in the very quality of the air, a subtle drop in temperature, a tightening of the atmosphere that made Elara look up from her work. 2 men stood at the far end of the reading room, their dark, impeccably tailored suits a jarring intrusion against the soft, worn textures of the space. One was the university dean, looking pale and flustered. The other was a man who seemed to absorb the light around him. He moved with a predator's economy of motion, his stillness more commanding than any gesture. His gaze swept the room not with curiosity, but with the cool, appraising glance of an auctioneer pricing the souls of the dead. This was not a visitor. This was an invasion. His name was Julian Thorne. Ilara knew the name, of course. It was a name whispered with a mixture of awe and terror in the financial pages she sometimes scanned online. A modern-day Midas whose touch turned everything not to gold, but to liquid assets and consolidated power. He was known as the architect of ruin, a man who built his empire on the beautifully preserved bones of venerable, old money institutions. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps in his mid-30s, with a face that looked as if it were carved from granite and then forgotten by the sculptor before any softness could be added. His eyes, the color of a winter storm, held no warmth, only an unnerving, analytical intelligence. He was the physical embodiment of the forces that were crushing her world. The dean led him towards the entrance of the climate-controlled vault, the inner sanctum where the rarest manuscripts were housed. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. That vault contained the heart of her father's research, the very collection he had dedicated his life to curating and understanding. Julian Thorne stopped before the heavy steel door, his expression unreadable as the dean fumbled with the access codes. He wasn't looking at the priceless artifacts visible through the reinforced glass. He was assessing the structure, the security, the very container itself. He saw a repository of assets, a line item on a balance sheet. Ilara saw a sanctuary, a sacred space filled with the accumulated wisdom and beauty of centuries, and a wave of protective fury, hot and unfamiliar, surged through her veins, drowning her customary fear. Without a conscious thought, Ilara rose from her workbench, her stool scraping loudly against the stone floor. The sound was a desecration, but she didn't care. She walked towards the vault, her steps measured and deliberate, her entire being focused on the man who was a living threat to everything she held dear. The dean's eyes widened in alarm as she approached, but she didn't look at him. Her gaze was locked on Julian Thorne. He turned his head slowly, his focus shifting from the vault to her. For a moment, his cold eyes registered a flicker of surprise, as if a piece of the scenery had suddenly detached itself and spoken. He saw a quiet, plainly dressed intern. She saw a conqueror standing at the gates of her city. She reached the vault just as the heavy door hissed open and stood directly in the entryway, physically barring his path. Her body was trembling, but her voice, when it came, was steady and clear. "You can't," she said, the two words hanging in the chilled, sterile air. "You can't just take them." She could feel the dean's panic radiating behind her, but her world had narrowed to the space between herself and Julian Thorne. He stood less than a foot away, a towering, motionless figure. She could smell the faint, clean scent of expensive wool and something else, something metallic and cold, like winter air. His stillness was absolute, a challenge in itself, forcing her to be the one to break the silence that followed her declaration. "These aren't just assets, Mr. Thorne," she continued, her voice gaining strength from a wellspring of righteous anger she never knew she possessed. "They're a legacy. This collection contains the original correspondence of poets, the annotated drafts of philosophers. It's the lifeblood of this university's humanities department. It is the work my father, the work Professor Vance, dedicated his entire career to preserving. To sell them off, to break up the collection, is an act of cultural vandalism. It's erasing history for profit." She gestured behind her, into the chilled, carefully lit vault, as if summoning the ghosts of every author to stand with her. She was defending not just paper and ink, but the very idea that some things in the world were beyond price. Julian Thorne did not respond immediately. He didn't sneer or dismiss her. Instead, he watched her, his head tilted slightly, a flicker of something unreadable in the depths of his storm-gray eyes. It wasn't anger or annoyance. It was appraisal. He was looking at her with the same unnerving intensity with which he had surveyed the room, as if he were cataloging her, assessing her value. He was arrested not by her impassioned words, which he had likely heard in some form 100 times before, from 100 desperate board members, but by the raw, unvarnished fire in her hazel eyes. He saw a fierce, defiant spirit inside a fragile vessel, an innocence that wasn't weak, but fortified. The world had taught him that everything could be bought, but her gaze was a direct, unblinking contradiction to his entire philosophy. The air in the small space crackled with a tension that had nothing to do with the acquisition. It was intensely personal, a silent clash of will between two opposing forces. He took a half-step forward, closing the distance between them until she was forced to crane her neck to meet his gaze. She could feel the warmth radiating from his body, a startling contrast to the coldness of his reputation. "Professor Vance's daughter," he stated, his voice a low, resonant baritone that vibrated through her. It wasn't a question. It was an identification, a classification. "Your loyalty is noteworthy." The word hung between them, imbued with a meaning she couldn't decipher. It felt less like a compliment, and more like he had just discovered a rare, unexpected specimen. Then, just as quickly, the moment was broken. He took a step back, the invisible current between them dissipating. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod to the dean. "We'll proceed with the inventory tomorrow," he said, his tone once again clipped and impersonal. He turned to leave, but paused and looked back at Ilara, his gaze lingering on her for a fraction of a second too long. "Preservation is a noble goal, Miss Vance," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a final judgment. "But everything, eventually, finds its price." He walked away without another word, his polished leather shoes echoing on the stone, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and more terrifying than any noise. Ilara stood frozen in the doorway of the vault, the cold air washing over her. Her body still hummed with the adrenaline of the confrontation, but a different kind of tremor was starting deep inside her. He had seen her. Not as an intern, not as an obstacle, but as something else, something he had labeled and filed away for future reference. The threat to the collection was real and immediate, but it was the memory of his gaze, that cold, analytical focus that had momentarily warmed with something akin to fascination, that truly terrified her. Julian Thorne had entered her sanctuary, and he had not only threatened its contents, he had marked her as one of its most interesting artifacts. The still waters of her life had been breached, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the tide was coming in. The days that followed were a quiet siege. Julian Thorne did not disappear. Instead, he became a fixture in the periphery of Ilara's world, a silent, brooding presence in the archive's main reading room. He would arrive each morning, long after she had settled into her work, and select a heavy tome from the shelves, though she never once saw him turn a page. He simply sat at a distant table, a monolith in a bespoke suit, and watched. His gaze was not overtly menacing. It was something far more unnerving. It was patient, analytical, the gaze of a biologist studying a specimen in its natural habitat. Ilara could feel the weight of it on her skin, a constant low-grade pressure that made the delicate act of mending paper feel like performing surgery under a spotlight. Her sanctuary had been occupied. She tried to ignore him, to retreat into the familiar comfort of her craft. She focused on the precise fold of a Japanese paper patch, the careful application of wheat starch paste, the gentle pressure of the bone folder. But his presence warped the very air, making the silence feel charged and heavy. Every rustle of a page, every quiet sigh she let escape, seemed to echo in the vast room, traveling directly to him. She found herself growing hyper-aware of her own movements, the way she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, the unconscious habit of biting her lower lip when concentrating. She was being catalogued, her small, quiet life being observed and recorded by a man who represented its potential annihilation. The quiet of the archive was no longer a comfort. It was a holding cell. After 3 days of this silent observation, he finally broke the unspoken truce. He approached her workbench, his movements so fluid and silent she didn't notice him until his shadow fell across the illuminated manuscript she was restoring. "A 14th century book of hours," he stated, his voice a low vibration that seemed to sink into the ancient wood of the table. "Flemish, by the looks of the marginalia." Ilara's hand stilled, her heart giving a painful lurch. His knowledge was unexpected, a chink in the armor of the ruthless Philistine she had constructed in her mind. She looked up, her gaze meeting his. The cold, analytical light was still there, but it was sharpened now with a focused, intellectual curiosity that was almost more intimidating than his silence. He was not just watching, he was learning her language. "It is," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. She cleared her throat, forcing a professional tone she did not feel. "The gold leaf is particularly fragile. It requires a delicate touch." She intended the words as a dismissal, a reminder of the chasm between his world of brute force acquisition and her world of careful preservation. But he didn't retreat. Instead, he leaned closer. His scent, that clean, cold smell of expensive wool and winter air, enveloping her. "Delicacy is its own form of power, Miss Vance," he said softly, his eyes fixed not on the book, but on her hands. "The power to hold back time, if only for a moment. A futile endeavor, but a beautiful one." The words were a strange cocktail of cynicism, and something that sounded almost like admiration, leaving her disarmed and confused. Their verbal sparring became a new, dangerous ritual. He would approach her with a question about provenance, a challenge to a point of historical interpretation, or an observation on codicology. Their conversations were a battlefield disguised as an academic debate. She fought for the intrinsic, soulful value of history, for the idea that a story's worth could not be quantified. He countered with the cold logic of the marketplace, the inevitability of decay, and the role of capital in preservation. Yet beneath the surface of their arguments, something else was happening. She saw the quick, agile mind behind the corporate raider, and he saw the fierce, unbending intellect behind the quiet intern. They were testing each other, circling a truth that had nothing to do with books and everything to do with the magnetic, terrifying pull growing between them. She began to feel his absence as acutely as she felt his presence. On the one day he didn't appear at the archive, the silence felt hollow and empty rather than peaceful. She found her eyes drifting to the empty chair at his usual table, a knot of disappointment tightening in her stomach. The realization horrified her. This man, this threat to her family's legacy, had become a focal point of her day. He was a storm on her placid horizon, and she was beginning to crave the crackle of lightning, the dangerous energy he brought into her gray, predictable world. The guilt was immediate and suffocating. How could she feel anything but contempt for the man who saw her father's life's work as a column of numbers on a spreadsheet? The moment that shattered her defenses came unexpectedly. She was in the narrow, dimly lit stacks, reaching for a heavy folio on a high shelf. Her fingers brushed against the spine, but it was just out of her grasp. Suddenly, a hand reached over her shoulder, its warmth radiating through the thin fabric of her blouse. Julian. He was standing directly behind her, his body a solid wall of heat, so close she could feel the rhythm of his breathing. He easily retrieved the book, his arm brushing against hers as he brought it down. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated electricity through her entire body. It was a feeling so alien, so powerful, it left her breathless, her mind completely blank. He held the book for a moment, not passing it to her immediately. The space between them was charged, the air thick with unspoken words. She could feel his gaze on the back of her neck, a sensation that was both unnerving and intensely intimate. "Be careful," he said, his voice a low murmur near her ear. "Some of these are heavier than they look." He was talking about the book, but the warning felt deeply personal, a caution against the very thing that was happening between them. When he finally placed the heavy volume in her hands, his fingers deliberately brushed against hers. The touch was a brand, a fleeting moment of contact that seared itself into her memory, leaving her skin tingling long after he had stepped away and disappeared back into the shadows of the stacks. That night, Alara couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed, the house silent around her, and replayed the moment in the stacks over and over. She could still feel the phantom sensation of his fingers against hers, the warmth of his body so close to her back. For the first time in years, she was intensely aware of her own body, of the blood humming in her veins, of a deep, unfamiliar ache coiling in her belly. It was desire, raw and undeniable, and it terrified her. This feeling was a betrayal of everything she was. A dutiful daughter, a quiet scholar, a woman who had locked her own needs away so completely she had forgotten they existed. Julian Thorne was not just a threat to her home. He was a threat to the very foundations of her identity. She found herself looking at her reflection with new, critical eyes. She saw the plain, practical way she wore her hair, the simple, shapeless clothes she chose for comfort, the perpetual exhaustion that shadowed her features. She had made herself invisible, a functional part of the background of her own life. But Julian Thorne saw her. He looked past the quiet facade and saw something he wanted to challenge, to understand, perhaps even to possess. The thought sent a thrill of fear and a darker, more seductive flicker of excitement through her. The idea of being truly seen after so long in the shadows was as intoxicating as it was dangerous. She was standing on the edge of a precipice, and a part of her, a wild and reckless part she never knew existed, wanted to jump. The next evening he found her working late, the sole occupant of the vast, echoing archive. The weight of another final notice from the bank, discovered in that afternoon's mail, sat like a stone in her chest. She hadn't been able to hide the despair from her face, and he noticed it instantly. He didn't ask what was wrong. Instead, he pulled up a chair across from her workbench, the sound scraping loudly in the silence. "My father built his first company from nothing," he said, his voice quiet, devoid of its usual sharp edges. "He lost it all to a man who had older money and better connections. A man who took everything, not because he needed it, but simply because he could." Ilara looked up, startled by the raw, unguarded confession. His face, illuminated by the soft glow of her desk lamp, was a mask of cold fury and something else. Something that looked like profound, ancient pain. "He taught me that in this world, there is no prize for second place," Julian continued, his gaze lost in a memory she couldn't see. "There is only one position that matters. Being first. It's the only thing that's real, the only thing that can't be taken from you, the only victory that is absolute." He wasn't talking about business anymore. He was unveiling the wound at the very core of his being, the obsessive, pathological need that drove him. He was showing her the ghost that haunted him. In that moment, her fear and anger were complicated by a sudden, sharp pang of empathy. She saw the lonely, wounded boy beneath the ruthless billionaire. He was a man driven not by greed, but by a desperate, all-consuming need to reclaim a victory he had been denied, to prove that he could not be beaten again. This revelation didn't excuse his actions, but it explained them in a way that was deeply, tragically human. It made him more dangerous, because it made him real. He was no longer a caricature of corporate power. He was a man with a soul deep enough to hold an immense, festering wound. And she was beginning to realize that, for reasons she couldn't fathom, he saw her as the potential cure. He saw the shift in her expression, the flicker of understanding in her eyes. A strange, tense silence fell between them, heavier than any of their arguments. It was a moment of profound, terrifying connection. He had shown her a piece of his brokenness, and she had not turned away. She had a choice. She could retreat back into the safety of her contempt, reinforcing the walls she had built around her heart. Or she could acknowledge the fragile human bridge that had just formed between them in the silent, hallowed space of the archive. The choice felt monumental, a turning point from which there would be no return. She was losing control, not just of her family's future, but of her own carefully guarded heart. Her moral compass, once so steady, began to spin wildly. Everything she believed in, duty, sacrifice, integrity, was being challenged by the complex reality of the man in front of her and the treacherous desires awakening within her. To save her father, to preserve the legacy he cherished, was her sacred duty. But what was the cost? She had always assumed the cost would be her own happiness, her own future. She had never imagined the price might be her very soul, offered up to a man who saw the world in terms of absolute victory and defeat. The dilemma was no longer a simple equation of money versus morality. It had become a tangled, impossible knot of duty, empathy, and a terrifying, burgeoning desire. He rose to leave, the moment of vulnerability passing as quickly as it had come. The mask of cool indifference settled back over his features, but his eyes held hers for a fraction of a second too long. In their stormy depths, she saw a silent plea, a raw hunger that went far beyond the acquisition of a manuscript collection. It was a hunger for something pure, something untouched, something he believed only she could give him. It was the look of a starving man gazing upon a feast. The intensity of it stole the air from her lungs, leaving her trembling. She understood with a sudden, chilling clarity that he wasn't just going to buy the collection. He was going to try to buy her, too. As his footsteps faded down the long hall, Ilara remained frozen at her workbench, the weight of an unspoken proposition hanging in the air. The choice was no longer theoretical. It was coming for her, as surely and as ruthlessly as Julian Thorne himself. She looked down at her hands, the hands that preserved the past, and saw how they trembled. She was caught between two impossible futures, a slow, noble decay into poverty and oblivion, or a salvation that would require her to sacrifice the one thing she had left that was truly her own. The archive, once her sanctuary, now felt like the antechamber to her own personal hell, and she had a terrifying feeling that she was about to walk willingly through the door. The transgression began not with a word, but with a choice. It was the evening of the annual University Benefactors Gala, an event Ilara was expected to attend, a small, meaningless obligation to maintain her internship. Instead, she stood before the hall mirror in the brownstone, dressed not in the simple, borrowed dress laid out on her bed, but in her plain street clothes. Her father was asleep, his breathing a soft, rhythmic sound from the library. She had given him his medication, kissed his paper-thin temple, and whispered a lie about the gala running late. Every nerve in her body screamed that this was a betrayal, a dereliction of a duty that had defined her. But a deeper, more powerful current was pulling her out into the night, towards a different kind of fulfillment, a different kind of ruin. She picked up her phone and sent a single 3-word text to the number he had given her. "I am ready." The taxi ride was a journey through a looking glass, carrying her from the gaslit historical charm of Back Bay to the cold, glittering modernity of the seaport. Each bridge they crossed felt like a point of no return. Julian Thorne's residence was not a home, it was a declaration. A penthouse that occupied the entire top floor of a sleek, obsidian tower that pierced the night sky. When the private elevator opened directly into his apartment, Ilara stepped into a world of profound silence and space. The room was a testament to minimalist austerity. Floors of polished concrete, furniture that was more sculpture than comfort, and an entire wall of floor-to-ceiling glass that revealed a breathtaking, godlike view of the city sprawling below. The air was chilled and still, smelling of nothing at all, a sterile vacuum waiting to be filled. She felt like an artifact placed in a display case, her own warm, messy humanity, a stark contrast to the room's cold perfection. He emerged from a darkened hallway not like a predator but like a ghost. He wore no suit, no armor of corporate power. He was dressed in his simple, dark cashmere sweater and trousers, his feet bare on the cold concrete. The sight was so disarming it stole her breath. His face, in the dim, ambient light from the city below, was stripped of its usual mask of command. She saw an exhaustion in his eyes that mirrored her own, and something else, a raw, nervous tension that tightened the lines around his mouth. He didn't speak. He simply walked towards her, his gaze locked on hers, and in that silent, charged approach, the contract, the money, the entire sordid arrangement dissolved into the background. This was no longer a transaction. It was a reckoning, a collision of two solitudes that had been orbiting each other for weeks, and the gravitational pull had finally become irresistible. He stopped a foot away from her, the space between them humming with a palpable energy. He lifted a hand, not to touch her, but as if to test the reality of the air between them. "You came," he whispered, and the two words were not a statement of victory, but a breath of profound, astonished relief. Then, slowly, as if he were afraid she might shatter, he reached out, and his fingers brushed against her cheek. The touch was not one of possession, but of reverence. It was a question. Ilara didn't flinch. She leaned into his touch, a small, almost imperceptible movement that was a complete and total surrender. It was her answer, a silent yes, that sealed her fate more surely than any signature on a legal document. In that moment, she was no longer just saving her father. She was answering a desperate, unspoken call from the man before her, and from the lonely, neglected corners of her own heart. He led her by the hand to the bedroom. The room was even more stark than the living area, dominated by a large, low bed, and another wall of glass that made it feel as though they were floating among the stars. There, In the cold, celestial light, he began to undress her. His movements were slow, deliberate, each action imbued with a strange, solemn ritualism. He unbuttoned her simple cotton blouse as if he were turning the fragile pages of a priceless manuscript. He unzipped her skirt with a steadiness that betrayed the tremor she could feel in his hand. As each layer of her clothing fell away, Alara felt she was shedding more than fabric. She was shedding the weight of her past, the skin of the dutiful daughter, the armor of her own repression. She stood before him, naked and trembling in the starlight, feeling more exposed and yet more herself than she had ever been. He didn't look at her with lust, but with a kind of desperate, painful awe. He traced the line of her collarbone with a single finger, his touch as light as a whisper. "I was 16, he said, his voice a raw, broken murmur against the silence. Her father was my father's business partner. I thought it was real. But he found a better match for her, someone from an older family, with more money. He bought her a car for her 17th birthday. I was working a summer job just to afford a corsage for the prom." He looked up at her, and the storm in his eyes was no longer one of anger, but of a grief so old and so deep it was terrifying. "They took it from me. The one pure, untouched thing I had. They made it into a transaction. They taught me that nothing is sacred." In that devastating confession, Alara understood everything. His ruthlessness, his obsession with primacy, his pathological need to acquire and own. It was all a desperate attempt to reclaim a piece of himself that had been stolen and sullied. He wasn't a monster. He was a man frozen in time, forever fighting the ghost of a battle he had already lost. An overwhelming wave of empathy washed over her, extinguishing the last embers of her fear. This wasn't a sacrifice anymore. It was something else entirely. She reached up, her hands cupping his face, forcing him to meet her gaze. "This isn't a transaction, Julian," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Look at me, this is a choice." And with those words, she pulled his head down to hers, closing the final distance between them, and claimed his mouth in a kiss that was both a surrender and a conquest. Their coming together was not a storm, but a quiet, cataclysmic merging. It was a collision of desperate needs and unspoken hungers. For Alara, the initial sting of pain was a grounding reality, a physical manifestation of the line she had just crossed, but it was quickly subsumed by a flood of sensations she had only ever read about in forbidden poetry. It was the rough texture of his jaw against her cheek, the surprising warmth of his skin, the solid, grounding weight of his body over hers. She was not being taken. She was participating in a sacred, terrible act of mutual discovery. He moved with a desperate, careful slowness, as if he were trying to memorize every second, to purify the moment with his own intensity. It was an act of profound, terrifying intimacy, a joining that felt less like a physical release and more like the setting of a broken bone. Afterward, they lay tangled in the sheets, the city lights a silent, glittering witness. The silence in the room was different now. It was not empty, but full, heavy with the weight of what had just happened. Julian held her, his arm wrapped tightly around her as if he feared she might dissolve into the starlight. His breathing was ragged, his body still trembling with the aftershocks of an emotional release that went far beyond the physical. Alara stared at the ceiling, her mind a strange, calm sea after a hurricane. She felt an ache deep within her, a physical echo of her lost innocence. But alongside it, there was no shame, no regret. There was only the startling, terrifying realization that in this act of ultimate transgression, she had found a piece of herself she never knew was missing. She had stepped out of her cage. He finally stirred, turning to look at her in the dim light. The ruthless billionaire was gone. The man looking at her now was unguarded, his eyes filled with a raw, terrifying vulnerability. The contract had been fulfilled. The debt was paid. But they both knew, with a certainty that needed no words, that a new, far more complex and binding debt had just been created between them. He had bought her body, but in doing so, he had inadvertently offered her a piece of his soul. And she, in sacrificing her innocence to save her family, had discovered a strength and a desire that would change the course of her life forever. They were no longer adversaries. They were co-conspirators in a beautiful, terrible crime, and neither of them would ever be the same. Dawn arrived not as a gentle awakening, but as a cold, clinical judgment. Ilara woke to the unsettling silence of Julian's penthouse. The space between her and the edge of the bed, a vast, empty territory. The warmth of his body was gone, leaving the high thread count sheets feeling like a silken shroud. On the bedside table, where a lover might have left a note, sat a sleek, black tablet. Its screen was illuminated with a single stark message, a confirmation of a wire transfer to an escrow account, the sum large enough to be incomprehensible. It was a digital receipt for services rendered, a cold, impersonal closing statement to the most intimate act of her life. The finality of it was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs and leaving her hollowed out, a beautifully preserved vessel from which the soul had been carefully extracted. The city below was waking up, oblivious, its distant hum a mocking counterpoint to the profound silence in her heart. She dressed in the clothes she had worn the night before, each garment feeling like a costume from a play that had reached its tragic conclusion. The simple cotton of her blouse felt rough against skin that was still hypersensitive, a map of phantom touches and remembered pressures. He was nowhere to be seen. The vast apartment was a sterile, empty museum, and she was the only exhibit left after closing. There was no goodbye, no final, lingering look. He had simply vanished, leaving the transaction to speak for itself. Her departure was as silent and anonymous as her arrival. The private elevator descended with a smooth, soundless efficiency, a vertical coffin lowering her back to a world she no longer belonged to. As she stepped out into the crisp, morning air of the financial district, the city felt alien, its towering glass structures reflecting a distorted, unfamiliar version of the woman she used to be. Returning to the brownstone was like stepping into a photograph of a life she once lived. The familiar scent of lemon polish and old paper wrapped around her. But it brought no comfort. It felt accusatory. Every book on the shelf, every worn piece of furniture, seemed to stare at her, silent witnesses to the secret she now carried. The house, once a prison of debt and worry, had been transformed into something far more sinister, a monument to her sacrifice, a beautiful cage she had purchased with her own flesh. She walked through the silent rooms, her hand trailing along the spines of her father's books, and felt a profound and terrifying dislocation. She was an imposter in her own home, a stranger wearing her own skin, and the quiet dignity of the house felt like a constant, unbearable reproach for the undignified act that had saved it. The promises Julian had made were fulfilled with the silent, terrifying efficiency of a ghost. The threatening letters from the bank ceased. The deed to the house arrived by courier, her name printed in stark, legal type. A highly qualified, compassionate in-home nurse appeared at their door, explaining she was funded by a new university grant for retired faculty, a lie so seamless and elegant it was its own form of cruelty. Her father's world was now secure, buffered from the harsh realities that had been crushing them. Ilara watched it all unfold with a sense of numb detachment. She had won. She had saved him. But the relief she had imagined, the deep exhale of a burden lifted, never came. It was replaced by the suffocating weight of the truth, a secret that isolated her more completely than poverty ever could. The freedom was a lie, a gilded cage with invisible bars. In his own sterile tower high above the city, Julian Thorne attempted to re-inhabit the armor he had worn his entire adult life. He immersed himself in the cold, hard logic of numbers, staring at stock tickers and acquisition reports, until the characters blurred into meaningless symbols. But the ghost of her was everywhere. He saw her defiant gaze in the boardroom, heard her quiet, steady voice in the silence between conference calls. He had sought to conquer the past, to claim a symbolic victory over the boy who had lost everything. He had wanted to possess the one thing that felt pure, to be the first and only. But the experience had not been a conquest. It had been an unveiling. She had looked at the wounded, broken thing inside him and had not recoiled. She had offered not submission, but a terrifying, healing empathy. That single act of grace was a greater threat to his carefully constructed world than any corporate rival. The silence he imposed was absolute. He became a fortress, his phone an impenetrable wall, his assistants a phalanx of polite, unmovable guards. For Ilara, this calculated withdrawal was a more profound violence than the proposition itself. It was a brutal, systematic erasure of the connection that had forged between them in the starlight. The man who had pursued her with a singular, obsessive focus, who had learned the language of her world to dismantle her defenses, now treated her as if she had never existed. The silence was his verdict. It told her that their night together, the confession and the cataclysmic intimacy, meant nothing. She was a clause and a contract, a debt that had been settled and filed away. The ghost of his presence in the archive had been more real than the man himself, and the hollowness he left behind was a constant, aching void. Her days became a battleground of conflicting emotions. The guilt was a physical presence, a cold stone in her stomach whenever she looked at her father. He would have moments of clarity, smiling at her with such pure, unadulterated love that she felt her secret would tear her apart. She had saved his life by desecrating the very values he had instilled in her. Yet, beneath the crushing waves of shame, a new and unfamiliar current was beginning to form. It was a hard, resilient core of anger. She had not been a passive victim. She had stared into the abyss of an impossible choice and had acted. She had wielded her own body, her own soul, as a weapon to protect the one she loved. The act that was designed to be her ultimate commodification had, in a strange and terrifying paradox, become the first truly powerful decision of her life. She returned to her work at the archive, the quiet, methodical tasks of preservation, a fragile anchor in the storm of her new reality. But she was not the same. The timid intern, who blended into the shadows of the stacks, was gone. When a visiting professor challenged her on a point of manuscript dating, she countered his argument with a calm, unassailable authority that left him speechless. Her movements were more deliberate, her gaze more direct. She no longer sought refuge in the silence, she commanded it. The scent of old paper and decaying leather no longer smelled of escape, but of history, of endurance, of battles fought and survived. She was a part of that history now, a living text with a secret, dangerous annotation in its margins. The world had tried to break her, and in the process it had forged her into something stronger. He found no peace in his victory. Julian's nights were sleepless, his days a hollow echo of his former ambition. He was haunted not by a memory of lust, but by the devastating purity of her kiss, an act that had been both a surrender and an absolution. He took to driving through the quiet, gaslit streets of her neighborhood late at night, parking his car in the shadows, and staring up at the warm, golden light in the windows of the brownstone. He had bought the house, secured its future, but he was forever in exile from the warmth it contained. He had craved her innocence, believing it would be a balm for his own corrupted soul, but what he now yearned for was her strength, her integrity, the fierce spirit that had met his darkness without flinching. He was a king in an empty castle, tormented by the one treasure he had acquired and then immediately lost. Ilara stood before the tall, arched window of her bedroom, looking out at the familiar cityscape. For years, this view had been a symbol of her confinement, a reminder of the vibrant world that existed just beyond her grasp. Tonight, it looked different. It looked like a territory waiting to be explored. The silence from Julian was no longer a rejection, but a release. He had paid her debt, but he had also set her free from the girl she used to be. She was alone, more profoundly alone than ever before, but it was the solitude of a survivor, not a victim. The price had been immense, a piece of her she would never reclaim, but what she had gained in return was a terrifying, exhilarating sense of her own agency. The future was an unwritten manuscript, and for the first time in her life, she felt ready to pick up the pen. Months passed, and the sharp, brutal edges of memory began to soften, not into forgiveness, but into a strange, quiet acceptance. Winter laid a blanket of pristine white over Boston, muffling the city's sounds and turning the brownstone into a warm, hushed sanctuary. The constant hum of financial anxiety was gone, replaced by the gentle, professional presence of the nurse and the steady, peaceful rhythm of her father's managed decline. Ilara moved through this new reality with a quiet confidence that was entirely her own. She had walked through fire and emerged, not unscathed, but forged. The memory of that night in the glass tower was no longer a source of shame, but a private, complex truth she carried within her, a secret core of strength that had been purchased at an impossible price. It was the scar that proved she had survived the wound, a permanent part of her own, revised history. The news arrived not as a whisper but as a seismic event that shook the foundations of the university. An anonymous benefactor had made a donation of an unprecedented scale, an 8-figure sum that would alter the course of the humanities department for generations to come. The whispers in the archive were of a new wing, of endowed chairs, of a digital future secured. Ilara listened to the excited chatter with a professional's curiosity, the details of the endowment seeming to belong to a world far removed from her own quiet work of mending paper and thread. Yet a small, cold seed of premonition planted itself in her heart. She knew, with the instinct of an animal that senses a distant storm, that anonymity on this scale was not an act of humility. It was a statement. It was a shield, designed to hide a truth too blinding to be seen in the light of day. The official announcement came a week later. In a crowded press conference, Ilara watched on a monitor in the archive's reading room. The dean, his face flushed with triumph, stood at a podium and unveiled the plans. The donation would fund the creation of a world-class research facility, a state-of-the-art center for the study and preservation of rare texts. Then he delivered the final, devastating detail. At the benefactor's sole, non-negotiable request, the dean announced, his voice booming, "This new institution will be named the Alistair Vance Center for Textual Preservation." A smattering of polite applause rippled through the room. For Ilara, the sound was deafening. The anonymity was no longer a shield. It was a signature. It was Julian's name, written in invisible ink across the sky. The gesture was a monument, built not of stone and steel, but of a terrible, beautiful, and unspoken truth. She fled to the deepest, most silent corner of the stacks, pressing her forehead against the cool, unyielding steel of a shelf. Her body trembled with the aftershocks of the revelation. This was not a gift. It was a confession. It was an apology written in the only language he knew, the language of overwhelming absolute power, now turned not to ruin but to restoration. He was honoring the very man whose legacy he had once used as a bargaining chip. He was preserving the sanctity of the world he had invaded. He was telling her, in a voice loud enough for the entire world to hear, but in a language only she could understand, that their night together had not been an ending. It had been a beginning. It had changed him. The realization was a tidal wave of emotion. Not forgiveness, not love, but a profound, shattering understanding that broke down the last of her defenses and left her weeping in the silent, hallowed dark. That night she stood in her father's library, the room where the terrible contract had been offered. The air was no longer thick with decay, but with a quiet, peaceful dignity. The house was safe. Her father was safe. She was safe. She looked out the window, her gaze traveling across the sparkling expanse of the city to the single dark tower that pierced the sky like a shard of obsidian. It no longer looked like a monument to her sacrifice. It looked like a lighthouse, a distant, solitary beacon in the night. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that their story was not over. It had simply entered a new, silent chapter. He had given her a future free from debt, and she, in turn, had given him a past he could finally begin to redeem. The scales, she realized, were now perfectly, terrifyingly balanced. She placed her hand against the cold window pane, the glass a fragile barrier between her world and his. The reflection that stared back was not the timid, frightened girl who had stood in that same spot months ago. It was a woman, forged in a crucible of impossible choices, her innocence replaced by a resilient, unshakable strength. The future was an unwritten manuscript, its pages blank and waiting. But for the first time, she was not afraid of what she would write. The story of what comes next is a journey we hope you'll join us for. If Ilara's choice and Julian's silent confession moved you, if you believe that even in the darkest transactions a spark of humanity can be found, please subscribe to our channel, share this story, and let us know in the comments what you believe she should write on that first blank page.